all the activities that we could identify that they conducted. We identified a person within the business who was an expert in that area, and then we looked at the tools that were employed worldwide to underline those activities. We could then put in our fixed points, so our decision points, so the award of a license and the activities that preceded that, the discovery well and the activities that preceded that. We also noticed that some of these activities repeated themselves in each of these boxes here, but used different tools. So we can confuse ourselves sometimes if we think we've identified an activity and we talk about that, but it's actually not exactly the same activity occurring in either of these places. It might have the same name, but you're going to a different level of detail when you're looking at it. And their feedback on this was very, very positive, to the point where this poster got stuck up on the wall in all the different work areas. For the first time, they found that just among their own functions, they could start talking to each other. So you had geologists and petrophysicists for the first time having a conversation and understanding what each other really did, understanding the processes that they all carry out, understanding that the tools that each other use. It proved to be very, very useful. So what's the next level that you could take this to? Maybe start thinking about data. So you've got some generic data types that might come in, and generic types that might go out. I'm not getting into any specifics yet, but just conceptual thinking. So perhaps if a geologist was planning out their work and what they were going to do, they could take those Lego blocks for that particular project, start sticking them together, and get an idea of what data they need to deal with. And then you might be a bit more specific and start to understand exactly which applications might be used for that particular workflow that's being constructed. And then you can start to think about the actual data types that are going to be used. You can start to look at whether that particular workflow is actually going to be possible, or from an IT perspective, what support that they're going to need on that particular project to be able to carry it out as effectively as possible. Maybe you need a tool to capture all of this. So this was the best I could find. I managed to download it this week. This is the Lego Designer. You can start putting all your blocks together. I haven't found a successful tool yet to put together those workflow diagrams. I've tried using Visio and using standard shapes, but I haven't progressed to a point where I can get them all to link together automatically. But there's certainly been an interest from many people within the business to understand how they could use a tool like this. Perhaps they could use it for planning. Perhaps they could use it at the end of a project to capture what they did in a repeatable and understandable format, so that then you can build an archive of projects that have been conducted in the past, communicate that to other people who are maybe trying to work in similar environments. So in summary, the workflow isn't something that actually exists. If you're trying to find the workflow, you're chasing a ghost. Instead, there's a number of workflows, a unique one for every single project. There are many, many workflows that are in place. And what I've proposed here is a flexible, component-based approach that might help to try to capture those workflows so we can describe and communicate them. And if we understand them, then we can support each of those blocks. And we've made some progress towards really understanding the business. So that's my take on things. I'd be very interested now to hear your point of view, and perhaps open the floor to questions. Anybody like to open up?
Yes, so what's your opinion how to find working workflow, some initial things to start? What do you think is your suggestion to start? If the workflow does not exist, what's your method to start?
The beginning points of this, if you're trying to map out workflows or these components in an organization, it can be a little bit difficult. That task, if you give that to a group of geologists and just say, could you have a go? They might be scratching their heads for a while and not know quite where to begin. The approach that we took was to make some stuff up and say, here are things that we think you do. And then, of course, they all laughed and said, it's nothing like that. Give me that piece of paper and started scribbling all over it. And then, very quickly, we had that picture of what they actually do. So by providing that starting point, that certainly helped. Does that answer that?
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Do you do any work, Richard, mapping the high-level business processes to provide a framework for those individual workflows? Or do you have sort of an out-of-the-box model that you say, right, this is how the business goes from beginning to end, and this is
There are certainly out-of-the-box models that are quite generic and that could fit any oil and gas company on a very high level, very generically. Quite often, organizations themselves at that more strategic level will already have an existing framework and some language that they use to describe those processes and decision points. And then it is possible to try to map those components to some of those decision points in that language that they're using.
And does the discussions you've had around defining those workflow elements there, does that drive discussions around things like applications, rationalization, for example? Does it help or does it hinder? Or is it, is there no sort of outcome in that area? People just accept to use what they use and that's that.
Yeah, well, it's quite a hot topic at the moment, isn't it? Applications rationalization. So trying to do more with less, trying to get rid of some unnecessary tools. And of course, when you talk about taking tools away, everybody puts their hand up and says, well, that's absolutely essential to what I do. In some cases, it actually is. And so it's very dangerous territory to start trying to take away these tools. But often, the people in the business, the geologists and geophysicists, don't have a way of communicating that outside of their specific area. And when it comes to money and asking for more money from the rest of the business, people look at it from the outside looking in and just go, well, you've got 2 or 3 things that seem to do the same thing. Let's get rid of 1 or 2 of them. Whereas this gives a way of describing why those particular tools are necessary. But it also highlights in some cases where there is overlap and there are too many applications that do exactly the same thing in one particular box. And then having this framework in place allows for that discussion around that particular process and allows the business to think about that and output a decision to say, okay, we've thought about this and we should settle on this particular tool. That's the one that we need. Also knowing what it interacts with, so what goes into it and what comes out, can help from a data flow point of view to feed into that decision as well, so to feed those interests in there as well.
So what has changed at that mid-sized gas company that you used as an example there from doing this? Where were they before and where are they afterwards at the end of this process?
Before, they were in a situation, I need to be more expansive. Okay. So before, they were in a position where they didn't actually know what applications they had worldwide because they were quite fragmented, a number of overseas offices that were quite independent. The starting point was just to do an application survey and find out what they actually had. And just that activity by itself was quite revealing, so that some people were quite surprised by what was out there. Then by going through this process and identifying some core tools, so actually we work with them to try to standardize on a set of core tools. So perhaps a tool set that every geologist in the company worldwide should have access to, something that every single geophysicist worldwide should have access to, and a number of specialist tools. And that helped to look at the duplicate functionality and start taking that away. And it's being used from a strategic point of view to plan what they want to do with their portfolio, so to feed into that thinking, so they can construct a roadmap of activities and programs that they want to carry out over the next couple of years to address some of these issues.
Do you think it goes to people as well, that they are afraid of, like, when people come and ask them, what do you do, how do you do it?
They can be. I mean, you certainly
yes, because you're talking about rationalizing the application, and when people are like put into the wall and say, what do you do and how do you do it, they feel like intimidated, like, okay, do I not do the right thing, do I not do it effective enough, or...
It's quite an interesting topic, actually, the people end of it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll find that the person who really is an expert in that subject doesn't realize it, so they don't feel that they're at a point in their career when they can speak for everybody else and say, well, this is the way it should be done. So there's that fear that comes into it. There's also could be a bit of a fear when you're trying to map out what the business does, that their uniqueness goes away. Once everybody else understands what they do, then maybe they're not the key person. It makes them more vulnerable to being replaced because what they do is well understood. And it's something that the business themselves are trying to do as well. They recognize that they have a lot of risk in having a lot of knowledge tied up in just a few key people. Certainly the demographic of oil and gas companies is such that a lot of knowledge is tied up with some very experienced